Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Relationships have the power to wound us and the power to heal us. As a clinical psychologist, author, and professor at Northwestern University, I've devoted my life to studying intimate partnerships and family dynamics. On Reimagining Love, I'm here to translate complex clinical topics into tools and takeaways that you can use in your relationships today. If you're ready to develop relational self-awareness and create vibrant and loving relationships with the people who matter most to you, you've come to the right place. I'm so glad that you're here. Hello and welcome back to Reimagining Love. Last month, I was joined by Dr. Ish Major for a frank discussion about modern masculinity. Well, today's discussion perhaps offers us a counter to that as we are exploring the intersection of modern feminism and romance. In what ways does patriarchy continue to shape our thoughts and our relationships? What would we want if we could move beyond what we've been taught we should want? And in a world that is largely leaving the traditional transactional nature of marriage behind, what value does marriage have in a feminist life? I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest, Kara Loewentheil, who joins me to tackle these questions and more. A graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School, Kara followed what she calls the Ivy League to coach pipeline when she left her academic career to become a life coach. Now, as the founder of the School of New Feminist Thought, creator of the Feminist Self-Help Society, and host of her immensely popular podcast, Unfuck Your Brain, Kara's work combines evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology, and feminist theory into concrete and practical teachings. And now, Kara is the author of her brand new book, Take Back Your Brain: How a Sexist Society Gets in Your Head and How to Get It Out. In the book, Kara asks a confronting question for women. What if every time you had a self-critical thought, you heard it in a man's voice? Kara argues that the truth is not far off. She offers a step-by-step system to identify and remove internalized oppression, to deprogram our thoughts from patriarchy's influence, and create new thought patterns rooted in self-confidence. And this work matters for our relationships because our socialization shows up in our love lives in profound and pervasive and sneaky ways. As you've heard me say before on the show, research has found that gender socialization plays out most narrowly and most rigidly in our romantic relationships. In our conversation, Kara breaks down the feedback loops that take our socialization, our beliefs, and our thoughts, and turn them into our behavior. Kara believes that when we understand where our thoughts come from, we can free ourselves from other people's expectations and create a life that centers in our true values. I really love how Kara's work unapologetically centers feminism. No matter where you are on the gender spectrum, I know this episode is going to remind you that we all play a part in dismantling patriarchy and systems of oppression, whether in big ways or small. Enjoy. Kara, thank you for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
I'm excited to meet you. This is our first date.
It is our first date, blind date, fixed up by our people.
That's right. That's right. Our people met our people. Well, I am so excited to get into all of the things, your new book, your feminist coaching, love and dating and sex and all of the things. But I want to start by asking you a question about you. Are you ready for the Reimagining Love question?
I'm ready.
So, Kara, will you talk to us a little bit about how you are reimagining love in one of your important relationships these days?
Yeah. So I'm engaged. We're getting married in July. I was not a girl who like dreamed about my wedding or thought about getting married. And every time we talk to a wedding vendor, they're like, send us your Pinterest inspiration board. And I'm like, I don't have a Pinterest inspiration board. Like, this is not, And so I guess this is reimagining a rite of passage, maybe. But to me, it's like taking the existing architecture that like society gives you for a relationship and then figuring out how you're going to make it your own. And I think that's sort of figuring out what it looks like to have a wedding that feels like my partner and I and like reflects our values and doesn't have some of the same weird patriarchal leftover markers of like, I'm not wearing white and I'm not like walking down the aisle to be given away, right? Like I'm not a gift from my parents to my partner and I don't need to pretend to be a virgin. And like all of these sort of strange markers of the wedding and sort of figuring out what it looks like to have a celebration of love in that way. And I think for me, even just thinking about getting married at all, like, what does it mean to be a wife? What does that category mean to people? What does society tell us about that category? So the whole thing has been, I think, an example of what I teach, which is like, we can't ever completely desocialize our brains. I can't get my brain back to some state of nature about weddings and relationships. I've gotten a lot of socialization as a woman in our society about love and marriage and weddings and relationships. But I'm also not somebody who's like, so I'm going to live off the grid with no connection to society. So I got to figure out how am I going to navigate this and make it my own. So I think that's the kind of reimagining that I feel like I'm currently doing.
Okay, well, when you say the W word of weddings, that's like one of my favorite topics. I think that weddings just give us such a concrete place to like highlight and explore all of the ways in which patriarchal messages get in, messages about love and connection get in. And it plays into like the intra-psychic stuff, like the stuff that comes up inside each person who's getting married, the dynamics between the two of them, and then of course, like the family systems that surround them. So it's like such a juicy space to be. So
that's the word we're trying to go with, juicy, as opposed to like
so much. We love the juicy. So, okay, I want to ask you, what do you think it was about your origin story or how you were made that you were not the girl who grew up dreaming of your wedding day? Like, how do you understand that part of you that you didn't grow up kind of looking towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's like the early family stuff, that wasn't the message I got growing up. I was raised in a kind of Jewish family that really valued education. And, it was for sure assumed that I should get married and have Jewish grandbabies, which, I did not do and is a source of consternation sometimes. The family, they've gotten on board now. But still, it was like that was assumed to be later and it wasn't supposed to be like your primary focus. So I think I had that. And then I don't remember even like becoming a feminist. I feel like I just like came out of the womb I was always kind of, from as far as I can remember, very aware of, gender dynamics and what the messages were about boys and girls and how people were treated. And so I think that was also a pretty early influence. And I think I have a very strong personality. I have like always had a very strong vision for my life. I was obsessed with dating and finding a romantic relationship, and I had a lot of drama around it, which I have talked, at length about on my podcast, Unfuck Your Brain. I coach around it all the time. But that was all related to that same socialization. But so it wasn't like I was like aromantic or not interested in relationships. I was, in fact, quite fixated on them. I just wasn't fixated on a wedding. And maybe that's partly actually because a lot of my dating drama came from a belief around sort of unworthiness or undesirability as a person in a larger body. Like the messages you get from society around that are very strong as well. And also just the messages women get. So maybe I just wasn't even like, I was like, wedding, we can't even worry about that. We got to we have to like, we're obsessed with
first things first.
Yeah, like getting into, finding some kind of quote unquote normal relationship. And then I think as I made a bunch of decisions in my life that took me outside the norms of what I'd grown up with, like that education achievement focused Jewish family was not like prepared to become a life coach on the internet. That wasn't the path that I was supposed to be on. So when I left my career as a lawyer and as a legal academic to make that big jump, it sort of just felt like, oh, I could just make this all up. And I think I became more open to different, alternative relationship structures, different things. So it's been kind of a shock to end up actually in this very domestic scenario that I was not heading for, where I like live with a partner, and we have his kids half the week, and I am like a stepmom or a bonus parent of some kind, and we're going to get married. So it's been a weird coming around.
Yeah. Well, and it's one that I can imagine there are infinite ways that the work that you do has really helped you address all of these like elements of the stages of your relationship development with your fiance. I was struck by this idea of like, how does the girl who never dreamt of her wedding, what does she create then for her wedding? Because I was thinking about then how many women there are who have a bit of a different journey than you, which I imagine this is what happens all the time in your coaching practice, where it's a girl who did grow up with the Pinterest board and was a bride for Halloween, which is always such a trip to me because you don't see like a groom. There's no such thing as a groom Halloween costume, but we do see, maybe less today.
I
but,
do think it's less common probably now. Yeah, looking at my
I think it is
kids.
too. I think it is
Yeah,
too.
that's not the thing, which I think is a good thing. That's a good social development.
I think so too, for sure. We never needed it, and we certainly don't need it now. But then there's a kind of different reckoning then for a woman who kind of has to come full circle, right? Where she grew up with these messages about dreaming of her wedding day, has kind of a feminist awakening, and then struggles to reconcile, like, do I still get to have a wedding? And how do I get to, do I get to kind of even pull in some of those more traditional elements while still feeling like it's my own? And so I think there's that tension between one's feminism and one's desire for marriage, certainly one's desire for a wedding. So what might you want to say to a listener who's kind of in that tension of like, do I get to still wear white if I'm a feminist? Do I get to still walk down the aisle with my dad if I'm a feminist? Like how can she hold all of that?
Yeah. So this is what I call the brain gap. So it's this sort of split brain phenomenon between your usually earlier socialization, like what you learn in your family, the messages you absorb from society. I'm 42, so you're growing up watching Cinderella and Snow White and classic sort of Disney films, which I feel like the new Disney has a better base of messages. The old Disney was definitely like, you find your prince and you live happily ever after, right? So you have that layer of socialization. And then for most of us, even someone like me who became a feminist early on, we're still talking like 8, 9, 10 in your teens. Like it's a later kind of, perspective. And so it creates this gap of like, why I have one set of thoughts from very early that drive like what I think that are often connected in my brain to very basic survival mechanisms of like, this is who you have to be loved, to be accepted, to be safe, to belong. And then I have this sort of more adult type understanding. My prefrontal cortex, the part of my brain that can understand abstract thinking and reasoning, has these sort of values of like equality and feminism and independence and right. And then there's a gap between them and it feels very like split brain. And so one of the things I love about going through this myself is I've always sort of preached is maybe the wrong word, but like taught, we have to be able to hold both of those and we can work on closing the gap. But what women do, because what women are taught to do is just to always criticize themselves for everything. So we like see that gap and then we just immediately assume like, well, now I feel bad. Now I feel like I'm a bad feminist, or now I feel guilty, or now I feel like I'm doing this wrong, or I shouldn't want these things, or I shouldn't have these beliefs. Or conversely, like I feel very, someone might think, I feel very sure I don't want my parents to walk me down the aisle, but I feel really guilty because they're going to want to walk me down the aisle. I feel, I don't want anybody at the wedding to think it's weird that I'm not doing this. So the reaction to the gap, rather than like, oh, understanding and self-compassion, women are not really socialized to extend that to themselves, is like immediate sort of self-criticism, guilt, shame, and, quandary of how to keep everybody happy all at the same time. So I always think that just even understanding why that's happening in your brain can help you change the way you think about it. It's not because like you're a bad feminist or there's something wrong with you, or like it totally makes sense. You have these two sets of thoughts. And if we can approach that with self-compassion and understanding, then we can start to try to like bring them together.
And make choices then that are responsive rather than reactive, right? Because if the idea is everything I learned growing up was wrong, so now my wedding has to be a rejection of everything, then you really aren't in a place of empowerment. You're just in a place of trying to prove the opposite or trying to be the opposite, kind of that 180 swing that I know, I'm sure that I went through that 8 ways to Sunday at different points in my development.
Yeah. And like if you're having a wedding, you're already not that radical. You're already not 180. You may as well.
You're already not 180.
Yeah, you're already engaging in state-sanctioned matrimony, so we might as well figure out a compromise. Like the radical ship has sailed already.
Okay, so you sort of gave us a little window into your journey of a traditionally academically trained Ivy League reproductive rights attorney who becomes not just a coach, but a feminist coach. So talk to us a little bit about your transition and especially what was it you were seeing and feeling in the coaching industry as you were joining it that led you to be really clear that you needed to create a business that was around feminist coaching?
Yeah, I call it the Ivy League to life coach pipeline. It's very common trajectory.
There's thousands
Super
behind
normal.
you.
Yeah, that's why you spent all that money on that law degree from Harvard, so you can become a life coach. It was actually great training. So, I mean, I found coaching because I was always, I don't like the word seeker, and I never defined it as spiritual for myself. But I just from a very young age was like, there's got to be a better way to like be a human than most people seem to know. Like this seems poorly managed. Most people's human experience, people seem like very reactive. They don't seem to know what they're doing. There's a lot of like unmanaged mind. There just has to be a better way. So I was like, set myself to therapy when I was 16 and have always been interested in sort of the mind and coaching and therapy and philosophy. And then I discovered the basis of the kind of coaching that I teach now, which is a sort of cognitive focused framework, which does involve the body also. That's where our feelings are. But no one had ever told me before I found this type of work that you could change the way you think and that all your thoughts weren't true. So that was like a real bombshell for me. That was shocking.
So say those two again, because right in the beginning of the book, you named those. That those were two ideas that blew the doors off for you. One, not everything you think is true. And two, you can change your thoughts. Those two ideas that seem so simple stopped you in your tracks.
Yeah. And that I think the third corollary is like, if you want to change how you feel, you have to change how you think. Because I used to just wake up and I think like most people every day just felt like, well, like, I don't know what kind of feeling bus is going to run me over today. Just like I'm like holding on for dear life while things happen to me and I react to them. And I just like hope nothing makes me feel terrible about myself today, which of course every day it did, because I didn't know at the time. That was the thought pattern I had. So I was always going to find a reason to feel terrible about myself because that's the program my brain was running. So those three pieces really, especially I think because I am very verbal, very cognitive, I had a lot of faith in my own like intelligence and discernment. So to hear that everything I thought wasn't true was like, at first seemed very rude and then was like quite shocking. And I see this in the kind of women who come to the work that I do are often also like, not always, but often college educated or graduate educated, like lawyers and doctors and architects. You're just smart women, cognitively driven women. And so I think the same thing, we put a lot of faith in our brains. And that can be a real benefit because you can use your brain to change your brain, but it does require like admitting that maybe some of your thoughts aren't true, which can be challenging when you're very sure that you are smart and self-aware. So I sort of got into this coaching. I was using it on myself. It was super helpful. I decided I was going to do this for, as a job. I really had no idea what that meant. I had never started a business or done anything like that. And then, as I got deeper into applying the work to myself and I started out coaching lawyers, like women lawyers. And, there's specific ways that law school teaches you to think that are very problematic for your life. So I was like really kind of focused on that. I just started to see that like there was this missing piece where I think a lot of people, myself included, had gone to a certain form of talk therapy where you're mostly focused on your childhood experiences, your nuclear family. The coaching industry focused a lot on evolutionary biology and evolutionary kind of psychology. And I think both of those are absolutely huge influences on your brain. But it was like nobody was talking about this third enormous influence, which is all of the messages that you get from society about who you are and what's valuable about you and what's important about you and who you're supposed to be and what is safe and what is dangerous, which your primitive brain really responds to. And so I was sort of like, I think there's a reason that like some of these tools are not clicking is because we're not seeing the ways in which women get specific socialization. So to give an example, like in a regular coaching program, you might learn people fear rejection because humans evolved in small tribes of hunter-gatherers and you had to depend on your neighbors to stay alive. I totally think that's true and that's there for everybody. Okay, but women and men get very different socialization about how important it is that other people like them and not reject them. And historically, women have literally needed male approval to stay alive because you couldn't have a job and you couldn't have a bank account and you couldn't support yourself. And you needed your father, your brothers, or a husband to take care of you. So when you think about millennia of that, you're getting a very different depth and intensity of message around rejection and people pleasing and who it's important to please than you are if you're a straight cis white man in our society. You're not getting the same messages. And that whole piece was basically missing from the coaching industry.
Well, and I would think in the absence of that, then coaching becomes too individualistic, right? It loses the context and it creates the space for shame of why can't I get this right? So I think that layer is really important.
Yeah, I think a good coach obviously is never trying to shame you, but I do think without that context, there's this another kind of gap where you're just I get this thing about the tribes, that doesn't feel like it's explaining the depth of what I'm experiencing. And what I found with women especially is that when we talk this through, and it's not just, it depends also on your other identities. When I'm, coaching a woman of color and she's talking about the messages she got from society about who's safe and who's dangerous and how she needs to behave in order to be safe, it's oh, there's that light bulb moment of okay, so of course it makes sense that I am relentlessly fixated on people pleasing, or I am, terrified to make a business pitch, even though I intellectually know that I'm not going to be killed in this room probably. So I think that, yes, that perspective just helps people understand why it feels so intense. And in order to change your thinking, you often, when you're having a really intense anxiety or some kind of reaction like that, I think you often need your first little baby step thought to kind of be responsive to that, right? So it's sort of a thought of it's fine for people to not like me. Not everybody's going to like me. It's well, that doesn't work if you think people not liking me will actually lead me to die and I'm in danger. So we need a thought that's much more it's okay that I feel this, but also I'm not in physical danger from a business pitch. So I think that both we didn't have the full picture of the problem, and then therefore correspondingly the solution, even on an individual level and helping with your thought change, not as tailored as it needed to be. And it can be much better tailored with that context.
So I want to get even a little bit more granular, because throughout the book, you are talking about how taking back your brain is a lot about understanding this feedback loop that we go through many, 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 many times in a day, which is thought, emotion, action, behavior, and then the results of that loop. The thought creates the emotion that guides a behavior that creates whatever the outcome is. And then we go through that again and again and again. So can you talk us through an example of how that process works and why it's so important that we understand how the thought creates the emotion, creates a behavior, creates the result?
Yeah, totally. And I usually, I think results is a great word. I also use the word return because I like thinking
returns.
about...
Sorry. No, that's totally the word you use. I'm sorry. Oh, I blew it.
No. Results is actually the word that the model as it was created uses, that my teacher uses. I've changed to return. Yeah, so it makes sense. And results is a great word. The reason I started using the word return is that I get a lot of perfectionistic, hypercritical people, right? That's because that was my brain. And so results can feel like all or nothing. With a return, you get to think well, I'm investing mental energy in one thought or the other. And what return is that investment creating?
Yes, thank you. I love that by making that mistake, you let us have a chance to understand why you chose the word returns, that it really is just about the consequence, just sort of what happens rather than this all or nothing results, success, few, done, check it and move on. Okay, good.
Yeah, right. And not sort of good or less good or bad kind of. I think it could become well, I have the result or I don't. If I don't have it, I'm doing it wrong. As opposed, which I don't think is how it was intended, but it's just easy to think that, Whereas I return, I think helps people just see more okay, well, I used to have 100% return this way, and now I'm getting, with a little thought, I'm getting a 10% difference, and then it's interest compounding. So let me give you an example of let's do an example in the context of relationships. So let's say that you have the thought about your partner that they don't care how your day was. And that means they don't care about you. And then you feel generally probably sad or rejected. And, it's important to say at the beginning, the model we use, it's not an equation that you do correctly or incorrectly. One person might feel sad, one person might feel rejected, one person might feel angry, even if you all had exactly the same thought, right? It just depends. And Probably your thought will be a little different by each person, but there's no like right emotion to have with a certain thought. So you think, my partner is not asking about my day because they don't care about me. You might feel sad, rejected, angry. Okay, let's say you feel angry. And then the question would be, how do you act when you're angry? So probably maybe you give them the silent treatment. Maybe you kind of storm around. Maybe you get on the phone with your mom and talk loudly about how your day was to try to get, like whatever you do. And again, the action line, very individual. People react totally differently. This is also a great example of why, like, as I talk about in the book, self-compassion is always the very first step to any of this, because in order to have an attitude of actual curiosity about yourself, you have to not be judging yourself all the time. So in the book, in the very first chapter, I teach this concept of how human of me that I learned from Judith Lassiter, which is a sort of phrase you can say to yourself anytime you catch yourself judging yourself. So I just want to say up front, like, you can't skip that part, because then when you start trying to look at your behavior, you can't tell yourself the truth about it. You're not going to be able to look at it if you're judging yourself. Okay, so you have this thought, they're not asking about my day because they don't care about me. Let's say you feel angry. Say your actions are you stomp around, you're short with them, you snap at them, or give them the silent treatment. So what return are we getting on that energy, right? Well, first of all, you're not really kind of caring about your own experience. You're creating this very negative experience for yourself and blaming it on them. You are not really caring about their experience. You're not asking how their day was, right? You're not really caring about the relationship, right? Because you're sort of more focused on feeling, rejected and ignored. And none of that, again, it's like, that's not criticism. That's just what our brain does. When I think this person doesn't care about me and I feel rejected, my natural instinct is to reject them back, right? Or to shut down. But when we think that way, where do we end up? Like, what's the return on that investment, right? Versus, let's say you do the work then to change your thought. And of course, in the book, I teach this tool called the thought ladder that helps you change any thought. And we're not going for one of the things I'm really strong about is we're not going for the perfect, most amazing thought. So we're not going from my partner's not asking about my day because they don't love me to my partner's the most amazing partner in the world and we have the best relationship ever. We're just going to go, what's a little more neutral? My partner's not asking about my day. I'm curious why, or I wonder what's going on with them. Even if that was your thought, then your feeling rather than angry would be curious. Then your actions might be totally different. You might be like, hey, honey, what's up? Or you might be like, hey, I just want to let you know I would really love it if you asked me how my day was. It's hard for me to volunteer and I'd love if you would ask me. You might ask about their day. You might take a bunch of different actions that are going to get you a better return than the return of preemptively deciding your partner doesn't care, then not caring about them, not caring about the relationship, and sort of creating further alienation rather than trying to come closer, especially when you may be the only person creating that distance in your mind, right? We have no idea what's going on. Maybe your partner just is listening to a podcast and hasn't finished yet and is going to ask you about your day in a minute. Or maybe like me, like a Jewish woman from New York dating a Midwesterner, I had to learn questions are considered prying. We had to have a lot of conversations about learning to ask questions, So, but if my assumption had been originally, he's asking questions so he doesn't care about me, I would never have made it this far in the relationship. And in fact, he's like an adoring golden retriever and I'm like a feral cat. Nobody could love me more than he loves me, anyone more than he loves me. But he just doesn't naturally ask questions. And I had my own presumptions about what a person does if they care about you that would have totally blocked that connection.
Yeah. I mean, that's just such a vital process because I think this happens in all of our close relationships, but I think in intimate partnership, it's just so easy to zoom right past the thought into the assumption, into the behavior, and not even see. I think especially for women where we are so accustomed to feeling disempowered, I know how easy it is for us to underestimate the power of a thought that creates the emotion, that creates a behavior, that creates the return. So there's something empowering in even just that process to understand one's own inside better. And then obviously then to be able to kind of play with what happens, what are the returns that you get back, and seeing what you're able to draw forward differently from your partner is incredibly empowering. But it can't happen until and unless that thought gets challenged.
Yeah. I mean, I think because women are socialized to be disempowered, right? We tend to, I think there's sometimes this reaction to hearing this that's sort of like, So you're saying like, it's my fault if I feel bad, or it's my fault if whatever, right? And I just like to think of the model as like a law of nature. It's not fault based. Like, it's like gravity. It's not like gravity's fault if a ball falls when you throw it. That's just what happens, right? It's not, we get to decide how to evaluate and interpret it. But if you're willing to accept responsibility, which isn't the same as blame, for what you're creating in your life, even unconsciously, I mean, that's the secret to life, because then you can actually reverse engineer it to create what you want, right? So anything you want to create in your life, you have such a better chance of creating it if you are able to consciously look at like, okay, what's that return I want? In any context, I want to, create a business. I want to write a book. Like I had to write this whole book. I had to use this model. If I just went with my initial thoughts, which are like, I don't know how to do this. It seems really hard. It seems overwhelming. I don't have enough time. I don't write like a million terrible thoughts. My return would probably have been no book if I hadn't gone in there. But my choice is to shame myself for thinking that, or to be like, all right, let me run these through the sequence. That return doesn't look great. That looks like probably no book. Like, what do I need to change it to create a different return? I mean, when you know how to do that, it's like, I really felt like when I learned this, I was sort of, does everybody know this? Like, why didn't I learn this in first grade? Like, what's happening?
Well, that is why you have 50 million downloads on your
That
podcast.
is why. And that's why there's a book, because everybody needs to know
That's
this.
right. Okay, so I want to go back to self-compassion, because it was beautiful how you paired them up in the book. Like they were just like right next to each other. You teach this process and then you teach us about self-compassion, because it's like, you're right. This taking ourselves through this process is risky because it opens a door for like, what's wrong with me? And so it has to be paired. That self-inquiry process, this is what I say all the time on my show, is any self-inquiry has got to be guided by self-compassion. And those 4 words that you use as that invocation of self-compassion are, how human of me. How human of me. Tell us about the power of those 4 words.
Yeah. So as I said, that's something I learned from a yoga teacher and meditation teacher named Judith Hanson Lassiter. And I think what's so brilliant about that phrase, and you'll see it attributed to various places, but that's the place I've seen it attributed most, is that when we are criticizing ourselves, we are inherently sort of differentiating between us and like all the good people who do things as they should, right? It's like not conscious, but self-criticism is this sort of like alienation and dehumanization of us, of like, you should be better, you should be different, you shouldn't be a flawed, normal human, you should be some kind of superior being, you're different than how you should be, and that's bad. And so I think how human of me is just such a beautiful shortcut for what I loved about it when I heard it was like, I've been teaching self-compassion for years. And I was like, oh, this is such a like 4-word nugget of like it's like a 4-word inoculation of self-compassion. It's like such a good way of doing it, because it really, for most people, it connects to them. I've had people say like, I don't identify with that. And sometimes people who have different sort of identifications or are neurodiverse in certain ways will say it doesn't resonate as much. So there are variations on it you can do, how whatever of me, X of me. But the same thing is happening, whatever word you're using, which is that you are sort of creating solidarity between yourself and other people and humanity, right? And you are like normalizing being flawed and not being perfect, which is sort of the opposite of self-criticism. Comes from perfectionism of like, I should never yell at my kids. I should never snap at my partner. I should never drink too much wine. I should never cry at work. I should never whatever. And how human of me just reminds you so quickly like, yep, that's part of the human experience. I mean, perfectionism, right, is the belief that you could somehow transcend the human experience and have a flawless one instead. And I'm always saying to my students, like, there's no exit ramp off the human experience.
Okay, so towards the end of the book, you really got me. Like, I think that I like audibly gasped when I read this part. And I keep thinking about it. And I don't know that I fully have it solidified. So I want you to spend some time on it. It comes towards the end. You're teaching the idea of radical acceptance. And suffering comes when we get stuck thinking that something shouldn't be the way that it is. Okay. I got you. I'm tracking. It's about, resisting, like dropping this thing of arguing with reality. And then you clarify that radical acceptance is not about condoning something or saying something is okay. Just something is. It is, right? Radical acceptance is dropping that argument with reality. Okay, fine. But then the oof that you really hit me with personally, Alexandra Solomon, you hit me with it, was why women in particular might be especially prone to arguing with reality. So I want to read your words to you and make sure you still stand by them, because I was like, is she really? Did she really?
Now I'm scared. I'm like, what did I write? I think it all made sense.
Okay, you say, in a strange way, I think we're attached to believing things should be different precisely because we've been socialized to believe that our own needs, desires, feelings, values, and hopes are not relevant or important to the world. Women are socialized to believe that they are usually getting it or doing it wrong, whatever it is, that their desires or their needs are less important than everyone else's, and that the only time they deserve any support or validation is when they are somehow proven to be objectively correct. We end up internalizing the tendency to question our own perceptions and second guess ourselves. And so we cling to the idea that something should be different in some objective sense to try to give our own feelings legitimacy. But your feelings are allowed just because you have them. Feelings aren't right or wrong. They aren't valid or invalid. There is no way to evaluate whether you should have a given feeling or are allowed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really fought to keep that part in the book at several points of the sort of process because I did think it was so important.
God damn, I'm glad you did. Okay, so break it down. So we women get stuck shoulding because I need that outside reality to change because I'm feeling something on the inside. And until and unless that objective reality is totally provable to everybody else, everyone else can see what I see, then my feelings aren't real.
Yeah. So let's take an example. I feel like a lot of women are very familiar with the idea of like something happens and then you have a response to it. And then you sort of crowdsource to see if people agree with that response, right? So it's like something happens in a dating context or at work or whatever. I feel like every one of us has sent at least one text to a friend that's like, here's everything that happened. Like, do you agree that I'm being reasonable or my boss is being unreasonable or this guy is not treating me right or whatever, right? Or this woman is not treating me right. Not to be heteronormative. Women can also be bad in dating, people of all genders. So it's like that instinct, right, is what I'm talking about. It's this like society teaches women all the time from birth that their perceptions are not reliable, right? This is like an age-old trope. It's why we have such an abysmal rate of conviction for rape and sexual assault cases. It's like why the phrase he said, she said even exists, right? Because women are just socialized to believe that they are emotional, they're flighty, they're irrational, they overreact, they're crazy, quote unquote. Like there's all the socializing leading to us to second guess ourselves. And when we talk about things that happen, there's always this sort of like, are you sure that was a sexist joke? Maybe you're overreacting. Are you sure that person put his hand on your ass? Maybe it was accidental. Are you right? It's like constant gaslighting. And I don't even love the term gaslighting, but on a broad level, that is what society does to women. And then we internalize all that. We constantly second guess and doubt ourselves. And then we feel like we're only, quote unquote, allowed to have a certain feeling if we're right. So like it has to be true and objective that the boss was unreasonable for us to be allowed to feel upset. Or it has to be true and objective that, the way that guy acted on the date was not cool for us to be allowed to be upset. So we like crowdsource from everybody. The irony is we still don't feel sure, right? That's why you can get 5 friends' opinions. And then when you go out for coffee with a 6th friend, you still tell them again. Because it's like it never feels like enough. Because it never will. No amount of like outside kind of corroboration will change your thought process. And so I think like because we have internalized that, then when it comes time to try to do some of this thought work at a deeper level and kind of release our attachment to, well, there's a certain thing that's right. There's a certain way things are. It's objective. There's a way that's bad and a way that's good. There's a way that people should be and a way that people shouldn't be. Like all of these very firm beliefs end up causing us suffering because the world doesn't cooperate with us. People act the way we don't think they should. The world has global circumstances that we don't think should exist. And so when we're trying to do this deep work of like radical acceptance, which, I just want to caveat, like I talk in the book about how that doesn't mean you just don't care what happens in the world and sit on your couch. But when we're trying to work on dropping this argument with reality, I think it can be harder for us because the alternative is you just have to decide what you want to believe about something. And we are socialized to believe that we can't trust ourselves to decide what to believe.
it captures so much of what I see when I'm working with, especially heterosexual couples in therapy. I think this is why it struck me so much, is that because her process has so often been that she's crowdsourced, that then by the time she brings her concern to her husband, she has gotten herself so in a place of should, right, wrong, good, bad, that then it fuels the thing that she freaking hates more than anything else, which is his defensiveness and him shutting down because he feels so like deer in the headlights in the face of her intensity. But she's gotten herself, I think the point that you're making here is that gender socialization, patriarchal socialization has made it so that we are ripe for that process of gathering all of our evidence and our data, saying it shouldn't be this way. And then we end up kind of coming in, like being what we call in the field of couples therapy, kind of offending from the victim position. We're feeling one down, but we've gotten ourselves in such a tizzy and a lather that then, we're coming in with all these shoulds and shouldn'ts.
Yeah, we're coming in being very attached to things being black or white because we're afraid of the shades of gray, because we've been socialized to not trust our own discernment and to not believe that we're just entitled. Like, if it's all shades of gray, you're actually entitled to just pick which shade of gray you want to believe. Like, it's not right or wrong. But even just that concept, there are people listening to this right now who are like, my brain is breaking. What are you talking about? Like, you can just, right? Like, what do you mean? What am I supposed to do then? What am I supposed to think, right? That's the most common question I get after this part of the breakthrough is like, well, then what am I supposed to think about it, right? And I'm like, I don't know, man. But like, we're going to help you try to decide what to choose for yourself. But I think that sort of, our rigidity can be, ironically, not so much from like being so sure we're right. Our rigidity actually comes from being so sure that we're always kind of wrong and then shaming ourselves about that we cling to any sort of like raft of certainty we can find, especially if, as you say, you've like crowdsourced it, everybody's gotten on board, everybody's agreed. It's like we only know how to navigate by that because women are not taught how to walk into a therapist room and just be like, this is the kind of relationship I want. And like, I want to figure out if we can do that together or if this is or isn't the right fit or where I am willing to compromise. Like, we don't think we're just allowed to be like, this is what I prefer or this is what I want. So we think we have to be like, this is the right way and the good way and the healthy way. And if you're not doing it, then that's bad.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about dating and romantic relationships because your book is really a journey through all these. First of all, you start with the brain, all these kind of ways to take back our brain. And then you move into taking back our life and you go through so many different domains. It's really such a beautiful book, Kara. Like it's a really loving journey and a really powerful journey that starts inside and you teach these really elemental tools and then you give the reader a chance like, okay, let's take it over here and talk about money. Let's take it over here and talk about body image, which is a really wonderful chapter. And let's take it over here and talk about your love life. And so in this part where you're working on helping us unfuck our love lives, is that how you'd say it?
Yeah, let's go.
Unfuck your brain, unfuck your love life. That we've got to look at all the gender socialization stuff. And the field of social psychology has found again and again and again that patriarchal messages, gender role socialization stuff plays out most rigidly and most narrowly in this realm of love and sex. So it's super important. And you talk about 4 traps, like the 4 traps of romantic socialization. So I think that's where I want us to kind of focus. You name them as insecurity, scarcity and settling, fixation and rumination, and magical thinking. So can you say a bit to us about each of the 4 traps? Like, can you start with the trap of insecurity?
And I'll say up front, like they all obviously sort of overlap and bleed into each other. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, is that the 1 or the 3? It's okay. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thought pattern. So insecurity, I think we just start with the premise that no matter how far we've come, like we obviously have made a lot of strides socially in the last 50, 100 years, women still receive the message that, and especially, there may even be a big difference between like people my age and people who are 22, but like certainly even still when I was growing up, right? The socialization and the message is still, it's great to have a career and you should do that too, but being married and being chosen by a man, because even though obviously many people don't date or have sex or marry men at all, the socialization is still very heteronormative, right? The kind of like message that we get. I do think that's changed a little bit, but there's still this focus on kind of partnership and marriage and that kind of like nuclear family formation that people still get. But certainly when I was growing up, it was still pretty like also it's just a man and a woman. And being married is or at least being seriously partnered and having children is sort of the natural role and consequence in a woman's life. You know, the big difference I feel like from my generation versus my grandma's generation was like in my grandma's generation, it was like, that's the main thing. That's what you're doing. Let's get that done by like 22. You know, maybe you teach in a school for 2 years before that, whatever. In my generation, it was like, no, you're going to go to college, you're going to go to graduate school, you're going to also have a career. But this thing still has to happen. Without this, it's a problem. So that is just baked in so deep. And when you look at like the media that children especially used to consume, that teenagers are watching, right? All the kind of romantic comedies we see, all of the ways that people talk about politicians, right? Like people asking women politicians how they balance their family and their job. Nobody's ever asked a man politician. Nobody's ever fucking said to Rick Santorum, I don't know if he has kids, but like, how do you balance being a dad and being a senator? Like literally no one's ever asked that question. So that stuff is still out there, right? This like belief that this message and assumption that being a wife or partner and a mother is like the natural role for women. So, okay, if that's the natural role, then if you aren't doing that and if you have not been chosen, then there's something wrong with you. And you need to be very worried about getting chosen, conforming yourself to expectations so that you will be chosen. And then sometimes there's brief respite if you're chosen, but a lot of people, once they've trained their brains to do that, are still worried after they get married all the time about like you can get married at 25 in a perfect fairy tale wedding as a straight woman to a straight man with a picket house. And I promise you're then in my coaching program and the inside of your brain is still, I don't know, maybe he's mad at me. I don't want to upset him. What if he leaves me? What if he, like, it never ends. So that insecurity comes from fundamentally women being socialized to believe that their romantic and marital status is the most important thing about them that proves if they're acceptable and normal and good enough. And so it's just a constant subject of fixation and of, you know, a place that sort of imperils your self-worth because it's not something you can always control and it is not internal. So that's the first one. So then that's insecurity. So that leads us straight into scarcity and settling. Because if you teach somebody this, and then especially when the message in society, especially for heterosexual women, is that, you know, there aren't that many good men out there. There aren't enough good men to go around, right? Men are somehow should be in charge, but also are bad and not trustworthy. And right. So you get this message that there's not enough to go around. You're getting older every day. As you get older, you become less and less desirable. And so you end up with this thought pattern that's like, well, I better just fucking grab one while I can or hope to be grabbed, right? And I need to, you know, that's the sort of scarcity is like there's not enough to go around. Settling is both being in a relationship that isn't what you want for whatever reason. You're not being treated the way you want. You just don't actually like the person that much. I mean, it's like astounding to me how many people will marry someone that fundamentally they don't actually like that much just because that was what happened. You know, you started
because of the insecurity.
Yeah, you felt insecure. You started dating. This is what you were supposed to do. You thought you'd feel safe once you just got that done. And then you end up actually literally married to someone that you maybe don't really like that much. So it leads to that settling. It also leads, this is, you know, patriarchy is bad for everybody. It leads, and absolutely women I think are more objectified and commodified in our society than men. I'll say that up front. But there is a way in which, because women are socialized to see being chosen and the quote unquote like value of the man that chooses you as the arbiter of their own value and worth, we end up also commodifying in return and objectifying in return, right? So like every dating profile that's like, you know, 6 feet and over only, like $100,000 a year salary and over only. Like it's just different things. We're told to value like height, income, and whatever, and men are told to value thinness and youth. Again, not saying it's an equal impact on society. The impact on women of objectification, I do think is much worse. But we can't deny that this happens and the kind of that sort of fixation and, you know, erodes the relationships on both sides. And it makes women sometimes very preoccupied with whether they're quote unquote settling if they're actually in a good relationship with someone they like, but who doesn't meet those social criteria.
Right, because she's still farming out parts of her self-worth via the relationship. So she needs him to be perfect and constantly proving his own worthiness so that she can anchor her worthiness. So yeah, it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yes. And that happens. You see all these relationship conflicts too. It's like, well, I want my partner to be more romantic. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, I want them to bring me flowers and plan picnics. Okay, why? Because then I'd be able to believe they really love me and like I'm, you know, really worth it. Well, you know, it's like my partner has ADHD, he's not going to put it together to plan a 3-week picnic. Like that does nothing to do with how much he loves me. That's just like how his brain works.
Not his skill set.
Yeah, not his skill set. And I'm never as excited to see him when he comes home because I'm a planner and he's a spontaneous. Like it has nothing, right? It's just how our brains work. So the third trap is rumination, which just obsessing, right? And part of the point there is to like help women really just, I went through this myself. It was like, okay, I'm a feminist. Logically, I understand that somebody who ghosted me after 2 dates who I met on Tinder is not actually an important person in the scheme of my life. I cannot stop thinking about it, right? I am like obsessing about it and looking at my phone and waiting for my phone to ring, right? And so that rumination makes sense in this context. There's a reason these 4 traps are in a row, right? Like if you teach people all of the things I just said, how are they not going to be obsessed with whether their Tinder app is going off, right? I mean, it's completely normal. It's not part of your brain. So that's the third trap is rumination. And then the fourth trap is magical thinking. And that is not unique to romantic situation. It's this very, very prevalent in body image stuff too with weight loss or, once I just finally look this way. But magical thinking is like, once I finally find that partner or finally get married or finally have the baby or finally whatever, then I'm going to finally feel good. Then I'm going to feel confident. Then I'm going to feel like I made it. I'm going to feel like an adult. I'm going to feel whatever. And you see it with weight loss too. Like once I'm at my high school weight again, then I'm going to feel confident. Then I'm going to like having sex with the lights on. Then I'm going to feel attractive. So magical thinking is the idea that by changing anything outside of yourself, and I count your body for this because we're talking about changing the body's appearance, changing your marital status, changing the body's appearance, whatever. And people do it even with like getting divorced. So it's not just getting married, but it's just that like the sort of magical thinking is that your relationship status is the key to happiness. And that if you change it, I mean, I always remember I had friends who got married in law school and I had conversations with both of them where they both were talking about different aspects of the other person's personality. And they were both like, well, they do this thing which drives me crazy. But like once we're married, they're not going to do that. I mean, you don't do that to your husband or you don't do that to your wife. And I was like, oh man, have I got, even that, I wasn't a coach yet, but I was like, that's not how that works. But so many people think that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to have the baby and then my partner is going to be more invested in the relationship.
Yeah.
We're going to get married. And then because I'll be a spouse, they're going to take me more seriously or care about my opinion on this.
And again, you're not making, magical thinking is not a value judgment. It's not a mark of poor character. But until and unless we learn to recognize that magical thinking is running the show, we can't go through a process of shifting.
You've been taught to think that way.
That's right. That's right.
How many movies end on the wedding day? Of course, you've been taught to think that. But it's such a dream killer because it means you don't take responsibility for what you can create. And you don't make hard decisions for like, okay, I've cleaned up my side of the street. Now, like, is this what I want or not? Because you're just like, no, if I just can push this to the next milestone, then everything's going to be different.
And I think that one of the things that can be so destabilizing about doing any of this work, therapy, your coaching work, is it can lead us, we can like sort of unwind our choices right down to the nub and get really scared that we've done everything wrong. But I think that there's something so empowering about learning to notice these thoughts, learning to notice these traps, and then making shifts with, I think many of these shifts happen within relationships. Relationships can move from one kind of architecture and one set of rules to something entirely different. So I think I want people to always be really careful about not having to undo and turn against themselves and turn against all their life choices.
And I don't think those choices aren't wrong.
Mm-mm.
Right? I mean, that's part of the point. It's sometimes people go halfway with this and they're like, oh, I could have thought different things, so that means the choices are wrong. And I'm like, no, we can also think different things about the choices. We can, there isn't a right or wrong. Let's say you did get into a relationship out of scarcity and settling. Okay, so what? So I have millions of people and it doesn't invalidate a relationship. And it doesn't mean that the relationship is necessarily bad or that you should have done it differently. Maybe there was also good stuff there and that relationship is going to endure and work. Maybe it's true that if you'd thought differently, you wouldn't be divorced now. But again, on some level, and I don't mean this flippantly, who cares? Like in the sense that your way you're thinking is going to be creating your current experience. Like it's over and done. You can be a happy person now as a divorced person. You maybe could have been happy in your marriage, but one isn't better than the other. And it's not a problem. That's this goes back to what we were talking about with the dropping the argument with reality, right? The point of thought work is not to like come up with a new way to argue with reality. Like, oh, I should have done it differently.
Oh, right.
If only I'd known how to change my thoughts, then I would have done it differently. And now things would be different. And I'm like, well, let's just change our thoughts about how things are now.
Right now.
That's all we're trying to do in the first place.
Oh, Kara, you are good. And by that, I mean, you are so skilled at what you do, and you are good because all this work, like I feel the like love and care that comes through your work and like how much you want, how much you want the people that you are interfacing with, whether it's your readers or your listeners or your coaching clients, to really just feel good on their own insides. So it's been so wonderful to have a chance to connect with you.
Thank you so much. You're such a thoughtful and careful reader. I really appreciate that.
So if somebody is new to you and your work, how can they learn more about you and connect with you?
So you can get the book anywhere that books are sold, and it's called Take Back Your Brain. And then my podcast is Unfuck Your Brain.
Wonderful. We will have links to that in all of the show notes. Thank you. Thank you, Kara.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kara, for joining me on Reimagining Love. If you want to find out more about Take Back Your Brain, how a sexist society gets in your head, and how to get it out, visit the link in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope that you will consider sharing it with a friend and sparking some wonderful conversation, and/or writing us a review for the show on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, be well. Reimagining Love is produced by Emily Reeves and edited by Mary Chan and Katie Pagich of Organized Sound Productions. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.